Oop, the recording's in progress. Okay.
My bad.
The folks who started the Hall of Fame needed it, and they needed it because they wanted a tourist attraction. The Cooperstown's economy was based on a pair of things: tourism, because it's right by a pretty lake and in the mountains, and folks from New York City would come up. But it's also based on beer, because the local crop there is hops. And in the 1920s, and then during the Depression, the hops crop crashed, and Prohibition stopped the sale of beer. So that seriously damaged the Cooperstown economy. And then the Depression killed tourism. People didn't have extra money to go up to the lake and go up to the mountains and whatnot. And the economy of Cooperstown was suffering. Stephen Clark and his family had an enormous amount of investment in the town. His wife was from Cooperstown. They owned a home there, but he built the hospital and a community center and the Otesaga Hotel and several other enterprises in the area. And he personally and his business were struggling. The town was struggling. And so they were looking for something that would reinvigorate the economy there. So he had an employee named Alexander Cleland who decided that they were going to build a baseball museum, or that would be a great idea, tie it to the mythical connection with Abner Doubleday. And Clark loved the idea, told Cleland, go ahead, make that happen. And so he set off to do that. Unfortunately, that meant, and he knew it, that the only way that could happen effectively was with the cooperation of the big leagues, of the major leagues. And the major leagues were, of course, segregated. He went to both the American and National Leagues. Ford Frick, who was acting president of the National League and then became president of the National League just shortly thereafter, loved the idea. He shot down the All-Star Game idea because they had just started the Major League All-Star Game and they didn't want a competing game. But he suggested the Hall of Fame be attached as part of a draw to the museum. And so, because of that suggestion, Frick is one of the two portraits, along with this one that you're seeing on your screen of Stephen Clark, that hang in the rotunda of the plaque gallery to this day. Ford Frick has stated in his own autobiography that being the founder of the Hall of Fame is the proudest part of his baseball life. So unfortunately, he was head of a league that was segregated. And because the league was segregated, that meant that the Hall of Fame, those who were founding it and establishing it, felt that they needed to be segregated too. They needed to follow along with what the major leagues wanted. So they had to cater to the fact that black players weren't allowed. And therefore, in the Hall of Fame, black players weren't going to be represented either. They felt that, or at least they and Ford felt that people would not buy tickets to a museum, or at least not as many people would buy tickets to a museum if it included an integrated group of players, which was different than what the major leagues had, which is ironic because they were trying desperately to attach Cooperstown to the origins of baseball. But the fact that they needed to exclude, in their minds, black players meant that they had to ignore the actual tie that they had to Cooperstown, which was the fact that Bud Fowler grew up in Cooperstown, learned to play baseball in Cooperstown. One of the best early black baseball players in America. They had to ignore the fact that he had an actual tie there and latch on to this phony Doubleday story instead, in order to tie the baseball community, the baseball origin story, to the community. And that stems directly from the fact that they were trying to have a tourist attraction that would marry up with societal norms, which at the time included segregation, unfortunately. So just kind of in summary around what they are and aren't. It's a tourist attraction, and that's important to keep in mind, because that is still sort of the mindset that they have now. They had to be aligned to the preferences of Major League Baseball. They were intended to reflect societal views, which unfortunately included segregation. That's what they were at the outset, and sort of still are. The Hall of Fame is not a member of the American Alliance of Museums. They're not terribly dedicated to factual information. Anybody who's been there has seen things that aren't exactly right. We have, they pretended at the outset that black people didn't didn't play ball, and they still pretend that there's no professional leagues in other parts of the world. There's the National Baseball Hall of Fame, and that's that. They're not interested in challenging norms, including segregation. This line at the bottom is in the book, and it comes directly from something that was said to me by a representative of the Hall of Fame when I was doing interviews for the book. This isn't a quote, this is from him, it's a quote from the book, but it stems from what he said. They felt they needed to reflect American public opinion rather than be something that made the public reflect. They're not there to change minds. They're there to reflect what already is thought by the public. So because of that, in order to get Black people in the Hall of Fame, some change had to happen. And some of the parties involved in that need to be discussed. So the book gets into detail about the people who set the course, Clark, Cleland, Frick, but also the incredible importance of J.G. Taylor Spink and the Sporting News, the Bible of Baseball, who was an incredibly vocal and very prominent advocate for the continued segregation of baseball. But then shifts into the focus on the folks who made things change. Again, the Hall of Fame is not going to change on its own. It has to have a change agent. It has to have a catalyst of some kind. In terms of getting them to lift their ban on Black players, on Negro leaguers and specifically, you needed to have some change agents, and that had to happen over time. The first ones were Happy Chandler, Jackie Robinson, World War II. We'll get into some detail around those. Bob Feller played an important role in a couple of different ways. Ted Williams became the first advocate for the Negro Leagues that anyone really paid attention to because he was Ted freaking Williams and he couldn't be ignored. He also said it on the steps of the Hall of Fame, which made it really hard for anybody to blow it off. Bowie Kuhn and Dick Young, the commissioner and the most prominent baseball writer at the time, who actually started to get the Hall of Fame to actually break down their barriers for Negro leaguers to be admitted. That dovetailed with the timing of Robert Peterson's Only the Ball Was White, which was the first mainstream large book that detailed the history of the Negro Leagues and in which he advocated for the inclusion of Negro leaguers in the Hall of Fame, something that Kuhn latched onto and cited himself as a primary motivation on pushing the Hall to make that change. Then fast forward several years to Ken Burns and his baseball documentary, which was another one of those catalysts that brought the Negro Leagues to the forefront of American culture. Buck O'Neil, of course, as the star of that and an ongoing continued advocate for recognition of the Negro Leagues. And then up to more modern times, George Floyd, who had nothing to do with it personally, but because of the situation around his death, launched social justice movements that included the Hall of Fame deciding and Major League Baseball deciding, okay, we're going to meld ourselves again to the ongoing public opinion changes that are happening in society. That included a reopening of the Hall for the consideration of Negro Leagues players. That included inducting Buck O'Neil and Bud Fowler, stripping Spink's name from the Career Excellence Award, so forth. Landis's name, Kennesaw Mountain Landis's name from the MVP. But that wouldn't have happened if not for George Floyd's murder and the ongoing social justice movement in America that was launched as a result of that. I think everybody knows the basics of segregation, so I don't, in baseball in particular, so I don't go into great detail here in the presentation or really in the book, other than to note specifically how the powers that be were kind of in multiple buckets. There was baseball leadership, meaning the folks at the commissioner, Frick, all of those folks, the presidents of the leagues, also the owners of the various teams who were dedicated to that segregation for their own financial reasons and as well as their own racist reasons. Then there was the BBWAA, the Baseball Writers Association of America, which itself was also segregated, which had minstrel shows at their New York chapter as part of their annual meeting and entertainment. They had as their head for many years, J.G. Taylor Spink, running the Sporting News, and then named their Career Excellence Award after him. And he had an enormous amount of sway in public opinion and was, of course, dedicated to segregation as well. And then there was the Hall of Fame itself, which had the same leadership as it had when it was founded. When it shifted to people like Ford Frick, who were also bought into that mindset from the outset. And as a result, we're a separate body of folks in power who had dedicated themselves to segregation and needed to be changed over time. So that was the environment when the Hall was founded, and it was the environment up until Jackie Robinson broke down the barrier of the color barrier, and then was so good that they had to elect him to the Hall of Fame, which became not only integrated baseball, but integrated the Hall of Fame as well as a result. That didn't happen though without a series of catalysts that had to take place. World War II was the primary one of those. There had been ongoing discussion amongst some writers. Lester Rodney was a prominent voice trying to get baseball to drop its segregation. Of course, Wendell Smith and others in the black newspaper community. But World War II and the fact that we were fighting against racist regimes and that over 1 million black men served in the military during that time really brought to light the fact that, hey, they're fighting against racism while being the subject of racism, the victims of racism in their own country. And it raised awareness in America among the public. At the same time, the commissioner of baseball died, someone who was very dedicated to continued segregation, Kennesaw Mountain Landis. His replacement, Happy Chandler, despite being from a state that was largely segregated, Kentucky, was very much in favor because of that service in World War II that he saw black soldiers and sailors and Marines making, was dedicated to the notion that segregation is wrong. That, this is famous quote, if black soldiers and sailors and whatnot can make it on Okinawa and Guadalcanal, they can make it in baseball. Negroes should not be banned just because they're Negroes, which was a surprising stance to everybody who was expecting something different. Shortly thereafter, Jackie Robinson, of course, then joined the Dodgers. And now we have folks at least having to think about whether or not the Hall of Fame should be continue to be segregated as it had been. Even the Baseball Writers Association of America finally, right around this time, integrated and allowed Wendell Smith in and Sam Lacey, the first black writers to be allowed to be members. So we start to see, because of the catalyst around World War II and the social justice mindset, that sort of the awakening of American mindset around that, is sort of the first step in that. Bob Feller plays an interesting role in all of this because, on the one hand, he didn't think black players were necessarily equal to white ones, and he said so publicly, and that, up to and including Jackie Robinson. However, he also gave them an enormous platform that they wouldn't have otherwise, because he was also very dedicated to making money, and he was happy to barnstorm after the season with black teams, with players like Satchel Paige leading the opposite team that he would barnstorm against. And it was enormously profitable for him, but it also gave those black players a great platform for the public to see that they were just as good as these white major leaguers that they were playing against. And that helped raise awareness that, if this is the quality of play, maybe we should consider having them in baseball, and maybe those leagues weren't that bad. After all, maybe they weren't second-class leagues. And so it helped raise that awareness. Then he went a step further, and in the same year that he was first eligible to enter the Hall of Fame, he ghost wrote a Saturday Evening Post article where he said Satchel Paige deserved a spot in Cooperstown. He didn't say deserved a spot on the plaque wall, in the plaque room with his own plaque and so forth. We should have a special niche for him, is kind of how he said it. But he at least raised the issue of putting someone who didn't meet the qualifications for Cooperstown that were currently in place, but should have a spot anyway, because he was only not there because he hadn't been given a chance, that he was a major league quality pitcher and an excellent one his whole life, and only segregation kept him from having the qualifications that the Hall of Fame was looking for. So that was an important piece. The problem, of course, is Bob Feller was about the biggest self-promoter in the world, And he was saying this at the time that he himself was up for nomination. And not a lot of folks paid attention to him. First of all, it was written, it wasn't spoken, but also it was coming from Bob Feller, who was enough of a blowhard that folks didn't necessarily pay attention to every single word that came out of his mouth or out of his pen in this case. But he said it right around the beginning of the civil rights movement as well. And as it was really getting going in the 60s around the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and so forth, and Jim Crow laws and separate but equal and black protesters and so forth. So as part of that, you started to see more members of the Baseball Writers Association sort of paying attention to things like Feller's statement, paying attention to what was going on in society. And Dave Condon, for instance, of the Chicago Tribune, using his column several times to say, hey, it's not fair that Negro Leaguers shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame. This is a piece of this Jim Crow culture we're trying to break down. People should start paying attention. And no immediate change took place as a result of that, but it was another one of those steps towards the Hall of Fame no longer being able to ignore the subject, because it was too much of a public interest story now, and too many people like Dave Condon, and using a very big platform in the Chicago Tribune, were saying things like that for it to continue to be ignored for long. But then Ted Williams came along and really took away all of their excuses, because he literally said on the steps of the Hall of Fame that Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson need to be there, because the only reason they weren't is because they weren't given a chance. This is right after he said, "Hey, keep going, Willie Mays, who had just tied my home run total. This is what baseball is about, is for everybody, regardless of race, to be able to prove themselves as excellent ball players." And he was cheering him on as he passed him, and then segued into his Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson comments. Unlike Feller 4 years earlier, people really couldn't ignore that. He said it in front of the leadership of the Hall of Fame on the steps of the Hall of Fame, and he was Ted Williams. And though Ted Williams was also known as a bit of a loud mouth at times, he was also an extremely conservative political person who had been a Marine in a couple of different wars and had the great respect. And he was a cut of, even, as good as Bob Feller was, I think folks looked at Ted Williams as a cut above, one of the most elite Hall of Fame, baseball players ever. And that made it very difficult for his words to be ignored. And shortly thereafter, you started to see shifting in a direct challenge to the Hall of Fame, as the commissioner of baseball, Bowie Kuhn, came in and picked up that mantle. Kuhn himself had grown up in Washington, D.C., and had worked the scoreboard at Griffith Stadium for Homestead Grays games. And so he'd seen Josh Gibson play, and he'd seen Buck Leonard play, and he was an enormous fan of Negro Leagues players. And so he was the lawyer for the National League at the time that Williams made his comments, and he was very much aware of them and latched onto that as something that he felt was a worthy cause. Dovetailed with Dick Young, who was the most well-known sports writer at the time. He was writing for the New York Daily News. He was, again, kind of like Feller, an odd, complex dude. There were times when he was, Jackie Robinson flat out felt he was a bigot. But then there was times like this when he advocated for Negro Leaguers to be allowed into the Hall of Fame. And even though he and Kuhn absolutely detested each other, they agreed on this issue and combined forces to go to the Hall of Fame and campaign the leadership, including Ford Frick, who was chairman of the board at that point of the Hall, to change their process and change their standards and allow Negro Leaguers in. Robert Peterson's book came out right at this time as well, Only the Ball Was White. And that was something that very much that Kuhn said later in his own autobiography, that he latched onto that and that it resonated with him. And Peterson, not just writing about the Negro Leagues as a piece of history, also in his epilogue advocated specifically for a plan that would put Negro Leaguers in the Hall of Fame, and gave numbers of Negro Leaguers that should be in the Hall of Fame to bring it up to what he felt at the time was par, and mathematically might have been par. And so after a 3 or 4 year campaign of that, they succeeded in 1971, and then the Hall of Fame finally kind of caved in. Originally, we're going to put in an all-star team of 9 players, and originally weren't going to be actual Hall of Famers. They were going to be on their own separate shared display outside of the plaque room. And that's where Satchel Paige comes into play, who was his own catalyst for change in a way, even while he was being the first one honored, because he said he would not accept that. He would not accept it the way it was being presented as a separate but equal prospect. And the title of the book is Cooperstown's Back Door, and this is the quote where that comes from. He said he wants to be in the Hall of Fame, but he won't go in the back door. There was a real chance that he would have declined it had they stuck to their guns and said they're going to continue to have the Negro Leaguers not officially be members of the Hall of Fame. And when that news broke, writers across the country, very prominent ones like Dick Young and like Jim Murray, said, look, this is more Jim Crow. Move it to Mississippi if you're not going to let him come in the front door. And that backdoor aspect of it became kind of a rallying cry and was mentioned frequently in all of these columns and editorials and whatnot. Kuhn later claimed that his strategy all along was to shame the Hall of Fame into doing the right thing by releasing the information that this was going to be a separate but equal backdoor kind of situation. I think that's a crock. I think that was something that he wrote in his autobiography after the fact to kind of rehabilitate a not great image that he had at that point in time. But regardless of how it came about, the push, the outcry over their original plan did get the Hall of Fame to say, okay, we will make them full-blown members of the Hall of Fame with their own individual plaques, which was a nice step in the right direction. Unfortunately, after that first wave, those 9 players, even though they gave up the original plan to technically have an all-star team and so forth, that's happens to be what they did by shoehorning Martin Dihigo in as a second baseman. They made it technically an all-star team, one at each position. And then they just dissolved that committee and handed it off to the Veterans Committee, who then spent most of the next 20 years largely ignoring the Negro Leagues again. They put in 2 additional, Rube Foster and Ray Dandridge, and otherwise they didn't do anything. And that was despite the fact that Roy Campanella and Monty Irvin and Buck O'Neill were on the committee and advocating for Negro Leaguers, and still they just didn't do it. They had years where they didn't fill their spots rather than fill them with Negro Leaguers. And so it got bad enough that the Negro Leaguers themselves went at a reunion in Ashland, Kentucky, and said, okay, well, we're going to start our own museum because you guys aren't treating us right. You're barely displaying our history, and you're shutting the doors to further admittance. That's how the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum here in Kansas City, which is where I'm located at the moment, came about as well, because that Ashland, Kentucky version didn't work. Many of the artifacts from it went to the actual Hall of Fame, but there were enough people, including Buck O'Neill, who still felt it was good to have a separate museum for the Negro Leagues, that it was established here in Kansas City right around that time in the late 80s. About 5 years after that is when Ken Burns's baseball documentary aired on PBS, 1994. And he made a very distinct point of having the Negro Leagues play a prominent role in that presentation, but also to have Buck O'Neill speak for them. And Buck O'Neill, for anybody who's heard Buck O'Neill or met Buck O'Neill, I would have great good fortune of meeting Buck O'Neill. You knew what a charismatic person he was. He was largely introduced to America in that documentary and became the star. If anybody saw the Civil War series that Ken Burns had done before that, where Shelby Foote, the historian Shelby Foote, well, he wasn't really a historian, but the writer Shelby Foote became the kind of the voice of that with his Southern drawl and whatnot. That's what Buck O'Neill became for the baseball series. And he started going on speaking appearances and television shows and whatnot, and raised public awareness of the Negro Leagues. And all of a sudden, the Hall of Fame was, oh, I guess maybe we should pay attention to the Negro Leagues again. And that's when they mandated that from 95 forward, or at least for the next many years from starting in 95, at least one former Negro Leaguer would also mandated had to be elected by the Veterans Committee each year. And that's how we got the next wave of folks into the Hall of Fame in that 95 to 01 timeframe. Buck O'Neill remained a member of the Veterans Committee during all of this time. He was president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City. He was telling the story of the Negro Leagues everywhere he could go. And now he had this elevated profile publicly as well because of his appearance in the baseball documentary. So his ongoing advocacy for that prompted a further change, and that was the new special committee that took place in 2006. Largely, most people think intended to get Buck O'Neill elected. It did not. It got 17 other members of the Negro Leagues, representatives of the Negro Leagues elected, but not Buck O'Neill, due to some infighting stuff that I outline in the book in more detail. I won't get into here, but there was some ugliness there about some rivalry between other folks and people on the committee, and some factions developed, and he didn't get elected. But he was one of the primary catalysts for getting the Hall of Fame to make even a further change in that 2006 period and have that second special committee. Then things kind of just stopped, and the Hall of Fame didn't elect anybody from the Negro Leagues for another 16 years until 2022. They did that special committee in 06 as to wrap up and handle the Negro Leagues for good, to kind of wash their hands of it. Unfortunately, there's folks like us and other members of SABR and advocates for the Negro Leagues, including the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, who felt that they hadn't completed the job. And the Hall of Fame wasn't paying attention to them. But when George Floyd was killed and social justice movements kind of swept the country, including sports, that's when they knew they needed to make a change to adapt to that. Baseball writers had dropped J.G. Taylor Spink's name. They had dropped Kennesaw Mountain Landis's name from the MVP. Major League Baseball recognized the Negro Leagues as official major leagues. The Hall of Fame, following their long-standing tradition of following public sentiment instead of leading public sentiment, followed in this case as well, officially allowed Negro Leaguers to be considered for the Classic Baseball Era Committee again, elected Buck O'Neill and Bud Fowler, and changed just this year their entire display of the Negro Leagues for their Black Baseball Initiative. It's now called the Souls of the Game, Voices of Black Baseball. I have not had the chance to go back to the Hall of Fame and see it since they reopened this past May. So I hope it is what they've described it as, which is a much more comprehensive view of the Negro Leagues and Blacks in baseball throughout history, but also that it's woven more through the Hall of Fame's displays, not just stuck in the one little room that they had to the side as it was in the past. That was the problem that you would find when you would go there prior to their change, which was that the story of Black players was not really told throughout the walk as you go through the Hall of Fame's kind of history. Their display of baseball history, they didn't really mention Black players. They had one room dedicated to Negro Leagues baseball, and you had to make a conscious decision to go into it. The rest of the floor for that was sort of a flow that you have to go to, but not that. That was a room you had to choose to go in. I'm hopeful that there's change to the display, and maybe when we have the discussion towards the end, if anybody's been since then, can update us. But they hopefully tell the story throughout. That's what they said they were going to do. They had folks like Bob Kendrick, who is the president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, on their committee, the Black Baseball Initiative. So hopefully their input was followed, and that they've made that change. So that's sort of the history. I, like most people who follow the Hall of Fame and the Negro Leagues, feel that they still have an underrepresentation of Negro Leaguers in the Hall of Fame. I don't make in the book any specific recommendations for players. That's been done very well by very many people. I do it on my website periodically. But in the book, I didn't, because what I wanted instead was to tell the history of it, and then in the end, kind of suggest what a lot of people have, which is they need another committee to true up that time period. I think most people recognize that the time period prior to integration in terms of Hall of Famers has been largely picked over. There are a few white players from that time period who have also been ignored. So I would recommend that any special committee that looks at that time period look at it holistically, not just the black players who were excluded, but everyone. However, they should do it with an eye towards truing up that time period in terms of what was actually represented. About a third of all major leaguers, now that the Negro Leagues have been recognized formally, about a third of all major leaguers from that time period were in the Negro Leagues. They are far from being a third of the Hall of Famers from that time period. So any kind of committee that would be formed should be tasked with not just putting in everybody who deserves to be in, who was overlooked so far, but doing it in a way that balances that time period's representation in the Hall as well as they can. It's never going to be to the exact percentage and so forth, but as well as they can do it, I think they should. What happens to that one time period once they've done that is up for discussion. I think they should still meet, maybe not in the same frequency every 3 years that the other eras committees meet, because that has been looked at, that time period has been looked at so stringently over the years. Maybe more like every 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, something like that, but they should still exist. They shouldn't be disbanded once they do their job. Then the classic era can kind of shift their focus from all of history up to 1980 to just integration 47 to 80 or something like that. That helps that group as well. And it just reduces the population of players who are looked at by that committee, while establishing this second one that still gives Negro Leaguers and other players from or umpires or whoever from that segregated time period a chance to get the recognition that's been overlooked for so long. So I leave with this, which is a photo I took. That's the statue of Satchel Paige. It's at the Hall of Fame. Unfortunately, we still need to work a bit on the Hall of Fame's tone deafness, because the only statue of Satchel Paige at the Hall of Fame is literally facing the back door. It's outside, not in, and it's facing the back door, which is the exact place he said he did not want to be. So I would hope that the Hall of Fame would kind of wake up and recognize that this is inappropriate, but also wake up and recognize that there's still some work to do in recognizing the Negro Leaguers that deserve to be in, and reopen the doors front and back to get them there where they belong. And that's it. That is my full-blown pitch. At the end of this, I do have like little QR codes for my book and my website, but let's have our Q&A period first.
Ted, you're on mute, buddy.
I know, I'm looking for it. I appreciate that, though. All right, I'm going to ask a question or two. I do have one question in the queue, and we'll go from there. Were there any writers or researchers, Paul, that led you down this path?
Joe Posnanski, I think, did a wonderful job as one of the more mainstream writers. He could have played things very safe. First of all, he was a writer for newspapers, and therefore not typically the audience that's going to be open to baseball history. He was writing more about active current baseball that's happening. So for him, when he started writing his books, to shift into the soul of baseball with Buck O'Neil, for instance, was a risk that he didn't have to take, and he did. And he's been an extraordinary advocate for the Negro Leagues, which is not something you see very commonly amongst the popular writers for baseball. You see it in niches, you'll see it with SABR groups, you'll see it with people who are historians. You don't see it with newspaper reporters very often, particularly very high profile ones. And the fact that he did that was sort of inspiring, actually. The fact that I'm in Kansas City and have access to things like the Negro Leagues Museum and Buck O'Neill, and going to the Royals games when they would have Negro Leagues Day, and there would actually be Buck O'Neill sitting out there waiting to give people autographs and things like that. That was more of an inspiration to get into Negro Leagues history than anything else.
All right. Well, the first question I have is from Milton, and you are unmuted, I think. So why don't you pose it, Milton?
Okay. Any of you guys have any thoughts on how current or recent Black Major League players feel about truing up the Negro League recognition in the Hall of Fame?
And if you could unmute yourself, I don't know if you can. Anybody, if you'd raise your hand, I'll call on you. I don't know how to unmute everybody.
Were you able to hear me?
Yes, we heard you, Milton.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, until others unmute, I can tell you that I don't know what current major leaguers, I've not seen quotes. I have seen, though, it's reported regularly here in town in Kansas City that whenever another team comes into town, particularly the Black members of that team go visit the Negro Leagues Museum. They're very engaged in the history of the Negro Leagues, and often will make comments about how this is important history that needs to be told and so forth. So I can't imagine that they would be anti-truing up the population, but I can't speak to any specific quotes or players who might have commented on it. I just know in general that they've seemed very engaged in the subject whenever they're here in town, and they seems every team seems to make an outing to the museum.
And I agree with that, Paul. But I also remember historically the ignorance of players, Black and white, as late as the late 70s. They really had no concept of the Negro Leagues as a major league.
Right.
I hope players and individual players are very active now. The outfielder from the Orioles, I don't recall his name, Dave Winfield, certainly. What was the name, Paul?
Adam Jones.
Adam Jones, very, so there are individuals that are very much in tune to help get those doors knocked down. Any more thoughts on that question?
I know particularly there's one, I'm sorry, John, I'll throw my one comment out and then you can. One of the biggest single individual contribution ever to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum was by Ichiro Suzuki. He came and toured the museum, and it just very much resonated with him to the point where he went home and wrote a $500,000 check. So he is, I think because he too is a minority who had to break into the league and face whatever challenges he had, including language barrier and so forth, a star in his own leagues that were largely ignored by the American public, right? So I think it hit him in a way that it didn't hit other major leaguers necessarily. And he's been extraordinarily generous to the museum ever since.
Okay, John, could you unmute? Could you unmute? You can't. Oh, boy. And all right, Karen, I'd like to unmute you. We shouldn't have let our expert leave the room.
I don't see any way. I can't. I can't unmute, unfortunately.
I'm sure I can. Let me see. I'd like to unmute everyone. John, if you have a question, I've asked people to write them down. That avoids the problem that I'm having now. I'm going to read what Will Clark just said. He thinks there needs to be a 2 to 3 year meeting every 2 to 3 years of an expanded Negro League election committee. 100% agreement, Will. Does anybody have expertise here that can help me? How did you I think I can invite everybody to unmute. I don't think I can do it individually.
Yeah, when you unmuted me, I got a little thing that popped up that allowed me to unmute myself, but I
Okay.
do it myself.
Okay.
And so did I.
I'm doing that now. So Karen, let me do you. Yeah, you should be unmuted. Karen, please pose your comment or question. Karen,
Oh, she
you're,
muted.
you're still muted. You can unmute yourself, I think. Sounds like you can't.
Try whatever you did again, because briefly she was unmuted.
Yeah.
Karen, expand your view screen
There you go.
so it fills up the whole screen.
Karen, you should be unmuted now. Well, you were, and then you went back on mute.
Yeah. If you unmute yourself, okay, there you are, Karen.
Okay, my question is, what about the women?
Well, that's interesting. I was originally going to write this about all underrepresented groups in the Hall of Fame.
Effa Manley?
Unfortunately, it became really clear really quickly that the Negro League story was going to dominate it. There's just so much more history there, and they had on par professional leagues. And as a result, there might have been a space for a chapter about other groups, Latin American leagues, Japanese leagues, so forth.
Yes.
But the Negro League story was just so much more expansive, and there was so much more material that it made more sense to cut it out. But yeah, that's also the other thing is that they at least did have a display that you had to walk through. The display for women is in the Hall of Fame, was part of the flow of traffic. You have to walk through it, or at least walk kind of by it or into it if you want to see everything on that floor. You did not have to do that with the Negro Leagues display. It was literally off in its own room that you had to make a decision to turn into.
Well, thank you.
Sure.
And I think that's still the case with the brand new Negro League exhibit. At least it's not a thoroughfare that you have to go through to visit the rest of the museum.
Okay. John, you look unmuted now. If you
cool.
Yeah.
So what do you suggest that we do as like Negro League influencers, right? Do to try to push the hall to get them to open this up again? Because in 2005, 2006, I was part of we did an email campaign to all the different guys here on the committee. One was a guy named Neil Langdot. He's a professor down at UDEL. And, through him, he told us who we could, send letters to. Is something like this what do you suggest we do this time? Because there's a lot of players, even just players like, I'm a Hilldale historian. There's two players that we really wanted to get in, and they just didn't have the numbers as the other 17, So what do you suggest that we do?
I don't have a specific suggestion beyond what you guys did the last time of trying to get in front of the people who would be making those decisions. Just recognize the point that I was making earlier is that absent something that's going to force the Hall of Fame to change, they won't.
Yeah.
That's been their full 90+ year history, that unless something takes place that makes them conform to public opinion, that makes them think public opinion has materially shifted from what they currently have on display, they will not change. They won't do it on their own. So it has to be kind of a loud chorus of folks saying that. I don't know that our current societal situation is one that is open to unfortunately, to hearing about equality for Black people and equal representation for Black people, or for women, to Karen's point. It's not a message that is out in society as a whole. It is one that is actively resisted in society at the moment and in politics at the moment. And the Hall of Fame is, and their leadership has always been, relatively conservative. I don't mean politically. I mean in terms of taking swings that society hasn't already taken for them.
Nice metaphor.
Yeah.
And you can tell you're a writer.
Yeah. If the upswell of public opinion hits them in a way that makes them realize, okay, we're out of step, we need course correction, they will. That's the good news. The bad news is individual voices saying that and writing it on their blog and whatnot is not going to do that, unfortunately. It can't hurt, but I'm just kind of expectation setting that there's not a great chance for success from that alone. Unfortunately.
A question I have for you that you admittedly avoided in your book. What players now are at the top of the pyramid, in your opinion, to be in that Hall of Fame?
I'd have a hard time narrowing it down from about 20, but if I had to, I'm going to list 3. And John Donaldson is absolutely one of them. Dick Lundy is absolutely one of them. I'd say Rap Dixon to kind of kiss your butt a little bit, but I'm not. I'm going to say Cannonball Redding instead. But to me, the biggest, easily most egregious problem that they have at the moment is Vic Harris not being in as a manager, because literally every single manager with 4 or more pennants is in the Hall of Fame. He is the only one who is not. And the fact that he is not is he is so wildly overqualified by whatever standards you want to look at for managers. He's got the best winning percentage. He's got the most pennants that aren't in the Hall of Fame. It's just, you can make arguments about, well, Cannonball Redding's career was largely before statistics were kept and blah, blah, blah. And same for John Donaldson. Okay. You cannot make that argument for Vic Harris and managing. There's a full record of it. There's not a single person in the Hall of Fame for their managing in the Negro Leagues. There's people who managed in the Negro Leagues who are in the Hall of Fame, but they're not there for that. They're there for other things. And it is an egregious oversight that needs to be fixed. As I can't say that any more passionately, so without raising my voice.
I am fully in agreement on that.
Thank you.
Regarding the camps, that is a totally egregious condition.
Okay. Any other questions? And is anybody unmuted?
Keith had a question in the chat part
Okay.
about why didn't the change happens, integration happens sooner. It actually happened, I think, as quickly as it could have once Landis was dead. He died that fall of 44. Chandler wasn't kind of up and running as commissioner until spring of 45. Jackie Robinson was scouted and signed that summer, and by September was signed with the Dodgers. I think that's probably about as quickly as they could have done it in the atmosphere that existed at the time. But it's a valid question. I think too that you still had folks like J.G. Taylor Spink with his enormous Bible of Baseball microphone, the Sporting News, who was complaining about stuff even well beyond that. When Bill Veeck signed Satchel Paige 4 years after that, he complained about how this is an embarrassment to baseball and blah, 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 blah. There was a lot of societal things that had to be overcome besides just Landis. And so I think Chandler and Branch Rickey did it about as quickly as they reasonably could have. It would have been much better if they could have done it sooner, obviously, but I think that was realistically the best time frame they had available to them.
And I think I can't get Keith to unmute, but I think his point, there you go. I think his point really was the fact that it was more people than just Landis. He's unmuted. He can speak to that himself.
I don't know. I didn't adjust my mic, but I was going to say that Chandler, I remember that in Chris Lamb's book, that the quote about, if a black boy can fight on Guadalcanal, he can play Major League Baseball. But McPhail played a big role in getting Chandler elected. And if you read Chandler's quotes to the press after his coming out party that McPhail throws for him at the New York Athletic Club, he starts to 100%. He's just like Larry McPhail. He says everything
Right.
McPhail, and he completely flip-flops on what he was saying right after he was elected, before he had actually become commissioner.
Right.
So I'm not really sure. Like, I know he did say that, but he also said just as many things that really upset a lot of people in the black press.
You're exactly right. That's correct. He's not a hero,
Right.
in comparison to really anybody but Landis.
He made himself baseball's great Ricky, thing. But he also ran with wanted to be vice president candidate for George Wallace.
Yeah. No, Chandler is a problematic guy along the lines of Feller, in many of the things that contradictions between what he said and what he did. But the key role he played was that Ricky was looking for air cover, and Chandler gave it to him that he was never going to get.
I would say that the Ives Quinn law gave Ricky the cover.
Oh no, it did. But you had a public statement.
It was illegal. It would be illegal as of July 1st. It was illegal for private businesses in New York State with 6 or more employees to discriminate against race. And he signed Jackie Robinson just weeks after that.
Sure. But the public at large was not anywhere near as aware of that law as they were of statements by the brand new commissioner of baseball that we're open to black people now. Was just not a thing they had heard.
Landis also said that. Landis said in 1942. Landis said, he said teams can have 25 black players if they want.
Right. But nobody believed him.
Said,
so it's like I could say everything about Landis. I could make Landis look like baseball's great emancipator. If I just picking like certain things that he said.
Well, no, you could, but he had no actions that actually backed that up. And while I understand that Chandler's actions weren't in alignment with that, Ricky's did. Ricky's actions aligned to what Chandler was saying, or at least fairly closely, whereas nobody did anything after Landis said those same things. So I think he's just going to get that credit that, that Landis had no business getting, because I don't think anybody believed Landis. Nothing ever happened while he was in charge to make this change. And something did happen under Chandler. Whether he should get credit for it or not is perfectly fair to raise. But I think the fact that he said it gave additional air cover to Ricky that he needed in the public.
Yeah, I buy that.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Ask it.
What can we do?
I'm sorry, say that again.
What can we do to facilitate the opening up of the Hall of Fame to Negro League, Black baseball, Latin American baseball, worldwide baseball?
Right. I honestly don't know. That's the point. I think it's similar to the question that John was asking, is that I don't see a path to the Hall of Fame making any changes to their existing process based solely on what is they're going to view as some niche advocates for justice in representation of the Negro Leagues in the Hall of Fame. They're going to view it that way, fairly or unfairly. That's how they've always viewed it. It's going to take some fairly heavy societal shift for that to happen. Now, continuing to say these things, raising awareness in any format that we've got, this one, blogs, books, interviews, podcasts, whatever those things may be, is certainly helpful. I don't know that it is sufficient without some other big catalytic event taking place that changes an entire mindset towards recognizing Black people in general, let alone Black people in baseball and the history of it, the Negro Leagues and so forth. That's just been the history of the entire Hall of Fame and their process. It's still owned and operated by the same family. I don't believe they've shifted in their leadership views terribly in terms of that particular piece, in terms of starting to be the lead in shifting public opinion. They are very much followers. And anything we can do to raise awareness around this is good. I don't know what would reach a critical mass sufficient for the leadership of the Hall of Fame to make a change.
Okay, Richard, fire away. Richard, turn your volume up. You're unmuted.
Paul, while he's doing that, you're at the museum now, is that correct?
No, I'm in my house.
Oh, okay.
I just have a lot of books. So
Okay. So the thing that changes everything is money. If the museum there in Kansas City could figure out a way to to flip the script, according to Google, they have about 75,000 visitors a year, and Cooperstown gets 275 to 300,000. If the museum could do some things differently about marketing, because I didn't know it existed, and I imagine that there are a lot of other people who don't know it exists. If that marketing could change and start driving more traffic there as opposed to Cooperstown, especially from the Black audience, that would make a big difference.
I think one of the biggest things they've done, and it's just been in the last, I want to say 2 years, 3 years, and this is going to sound dumb, particularly to old heads like me with a gray beard and whatnot, is that there are Negro Leagues players in MLB The Show, the video game. And you can, and young generation of people who are playing ball or playing video games online can play as Negro Leaguers, can play out the entire Negro Leagues if they feel like it, right? Which is, that's silly to people like me who does not play video games, but it is incredibly important to a younger generation that, to the point that Ted was making earlier, sometimes don't even know the Negro Leagues existed, right? The Negro Leagues Baseball Museum was key in that. They were very heavily involved in branding all of that, in licensing all of that. They part and parcel of this Black Baseball Initiative with the Hall of Fame. I don't think you're going to see the Negro Leagues Museum advocate separately for themselves to replace the Hall of Fame. They have decided to sort of partner with them. Bob Kendrick was on the Black Baseball Initiative for the Hall of Fame. They've started to share artifacts back and forth, which did not really happen much in the past. So they've tied themselves closer to the Hall of Fame instead of setting themselves up as a separate kind of alternate Hall of Fame. They are more a traditional museum, and they have set themselves up as that. They have an enormous expansion ongoing at the moment. They own the building where the Negro Leagues were founded, the Paseo YMCA that was founded here in Kansas City in 1920. They own that building, and they are intending to raise $25 million to renovate it and have it and expand it and have it become the museum. At the moment, it's in the old 18th and Vine area of Kansas City, which was the old jazz area and whatnot. It's next to the American Jazz Museum. It's a great area, but it's kind of shoehorned into a former theater. It's not a museum space. It's not a big physical space. They're trying to transform it and do that. They got $1 million donation from Major League Baseball toward that goal. And we're open to having their, the players they represent, Negro Leaguers, included in the licensing for MLB The Show, which is not an insignificant thing for Major League Baseball to agree to give up a chunk of their licensing money that they get to highlight Negro Leagues players from 75 years ago. So there's steps being taken at the Negro Leagues Museum is part and parcel of, but I don't think you're going to see them advocate as like that we're a separate thing. They want to be pulled in closer and make baseball and the Hall of Fame raise their game to match it.
Anything else for the good of the order? I wish we could hear you, Richard.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Hey, you got me. I have couple of questions. One you kind of answered. The hall's almost 100 years old. And if you got any list of historians, white players, black players, whatever, you could probably come up with a consensus of adding. Most people come up with 80, maybe 90 names. Nobody's talking about adding 400 names.
Right.
Why? What is the resistance with all their committees? They,
Well, I don't find their veterans committees for the contemporary folks to be terribly restrictive at all. I think the Hall of Fame decided, how do I put this? The Hall of Fame, it's good business for the Hall of Fame to have somebody elected every year. And so they put speed brakes, so to speak, on their committees to prevent everybody getting elected at once and then running the risk of running out of candidates and whatnot. In their minds, they think they might. I don't think it's possible for them to run out of candidates, but they've had years where nobody got elected and it was horrible business, right? So I think their committee structure is gamed in a way to slow that down, narrow it down to, we're only going to have, I mean, look at the contemporary ballot this year. There's no hope of some of those guys getting elected. However you stand on PEDs or not, Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens aren't getting elected, right? But they can't eliminate them. They don't want to keep talking about them, but they can't eliminate them until they fail to get 5 votes or whatever, right? And then have that happen a couple of times. So they have to put them on there. Otherwise, people are going to keep talking about it, right? Then they put on someone like Carlos Delgado, who is a good player. I don't know that he's not Lou Whitaker. He's not somebody who has an actual case to get in the Hall of Fame per se, compared to many people that they passed over, right? They put on Fernando Valenzuela. He has nothing like the case that somebody like Dwight Gooden has, or even Oral Hershiser, his teammate with the Dodgers, right? I think they put some people on there to lose, to not get votes. They put others on, and then they narrowed it down to, okay, this is the year we finally get Don Mattingly and Dale Murphy in, right? This is the year. And we're going to limit the number of votes that can be cast by each committee member, so that even when we've narrowed it down to just 8, there's no way more than 4 can get in, because we've limited the number of votes that can be cast. So I think that's it. It's essentially a speed break on their part to keep every year there's going to be not just baseball writer candidates elected, but there's going to be candidates from the veterans committees that are eras committees now that are elected every year too, so they don't run the risk of having a 0 inductee year.
And the other question I have, this one might be a little bit more loaded. You see any problem with the current baseball writers voting? It seems a little weird to me. You brought up Lou Whitaker. Alan Trammell goes in, Lou Whitaker gets less than 5%. I'm a Phillies fan. There's no way that Chase Utley gets 3 times the amount of votes that Jimmy Rollins gets.
Right.
I'm seeing some of that. Kenny Lofton gets blamed for being on 100 teams. Well, Gaylord Perry was on 100 teams. Do you see something still going on today, or is it just a matter of opinion that?
I think some of those guys were, I think you get, no, I don't know that there's anything, I don't think there's any conspiracies happening here. Let's put it that way. I think what's happening is that you've got, you had that huge chunk of time where the PED guys were sucking up X number of votes, and they're largely through. Those guys are largely off the ballot, the BBWAA ballot at this point, but they were sucking up a lot of air and attention and votes. And that put guys like Kenny Lofton and Jimmy Rollins in the disadvantageous spot, because those are votes that they can't get because everybody's limited to 10, right? They not only limited them to 10, but then they limited the number of years from 15 to 10 that you could be on it, which further compressed everything. And then on top of that, you had this entire shift of thinking from a lot of writers from old analytics to new analytics. And many of those new analytics folks who see people like Lou Whitaker and Dwight Evans and folks like that as being overqualified, they haven't had their 10-year requisite time period in the Baseball Writers Association of America to be eligible to vote yet, or they're still outnumbered by kind of the older traditional folks. Now that's going to shift. Those demographics continue to shift over time. And you know, I don't want to denigrate everybody of my generation as being stuck in the old model of, you know, wins and RBIs as the way to look at players. But too many of them are, and that puts brakes on people like Whitaker and whatnot. because there's not enough people who look at that and say, but he's a 75 WAR player who walked all the time and he had power as a second baseman who played good defense and could run. He was a 5-tool player. He didn't have the big sparkly, well, how come he wasn't on more all-star teams? It's kind of, there's too big a contingent of that still in the voting body of the BBWAA. And I think that's what we're seeing, is this shift in how players are viewed, and the population of the BBWAA voters still is in the midst of that shift. And you get players who get screwed as a result, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Anything else from anybody? I have a couple things to say. So glad to see you, Will and Milton.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you for
13,
inviting.
13 people and 2 African Americans. Now, it's not their fault, but it's a task that at the SABR Negro League Committee, we take a lot of, I don't know if responsibility is the right word, but we need to increase interest. And that game that Paul talked about, which Rap is on, is a good feature. But we're always looking for ideas, and maybe we should have Dr. Brunson, who is the co-chairman of our committee. Maybe we should have him here sometime just to talk about that issue and try to get some ideas as to how to foster more historical, historians from that realm. And one more before anybody wants to add to that. I want to reiterate what I said earlier. I hope everybody here belongs to the SABR Negro League Committee. And if so, you're going to get an invite to read the periodical that Milton edits and publishes online, and that I contribute every couple weeks, an article that is solely driven by participation of people that ask a question that they have an interest in. So watch your email if you're on the SABR Negro League Committee, and if you're not, join.
I will join, but I'd also like to recommend inviting Phil Dixon.
Oh, sure. Phil has not been invited here, but he participates with the Josh Gibson Foundation. Phil's not a wallflower, that's for sure. But yes, well, he was invited here today, in fact. But yes, Phil Dixon and Larry Lester, in my opinion, are the 2 most prominent African American, and really, I think, overall voices in the Negro Leagues situation.
Absolutely. And more of these.
That's right. Well, the Josh Gibson Foundation, we do meet 6 times a year. There's a group out of Cleveland, CCCF. Ike Brooks runs it, and they meet about 6 times a year. So you can find them. And maybe that's something that I should add to my column in Milton's periodical about these Zoom meetings that are out there for people to attend.
Absolutely. More awareness of these, more of them, get more people involved.
Yep.
Get more voices.
Anything else before I shut this down and have lunch?
Excellent. This was great.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Paul, for sharing your wisdom. And thank all of you for being patient with my working the unmute. All right. We're off.
Thanks a bunch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
I think we're done. Although I don't know. I'm going to close this down. Bye-bye.